Good morning and welcome to Rising. Thanks for tuning in. We've got an excellent show for you today, and I think we should just get right to it. How about that, Briahna?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, well, pro-Palestine demonstrators at Columbia University took a turn overnight as they stormed and barricaded themselves in one of the academic buildings on campus, Hamilton Hall, the site of 1968 student takeover protesting the Vietnam War and a 1985 takeover that preceded the university's divestment from South Africa over apartheid.
The latest escalation follows suspensions the school imposed on students who refused to leave the encampments and issued a 2 p.m. deadline to clear it out. Overnight, dozens of protesters breached the building and flying Palestinian flags and signs reading Hind Hall, which is the name Hind of a 5-year-old girl killed in Gaza by the Israeli military after surviving a tank attack on the vehicle in which she was fleeing with 6 of her relatives, who were all killed. If you recall, Hind's death went viral after the Red Crescent medical dispatch sent to rescue her was also bombed, and her emergency phone call with the Red Crescent leading up to her death itself went viral. The protesters also hung signs reading Intifada, the Arabic word for uprising, liberation, education, and Gaza calls, Columbia falls. The group Columbia University Apartheid Divest posted a press release on Twitter at 2:07 a.m. describing the protesters occupying Hamilton as an autonomous group and explaining the choice to take the building as a reaction to the university's response to peaceful protests, which included, quote, calling armed riot cops for the largest mass arrests on campus since 1968. The statement went on to say that Columbia has forced protesters to escalate by contributing to a genocide while refusing to follow baseline standards of conduct that make negotiation possible. Rising reached out to Columbia for further comment, but haven't heard back yet.
Tensions are running high at dozens of other colleges around the country, too, as encampments and protests continue, with some even targeting Jewish students, blocking them from entering the campus. A parent of a UCL student called the UCLA police to file a complaint that proved to be futile. Here's the recording of that call.
They said because he's Jewish, he cannot enter that area and that they won't issue him a wristband.
So that wasn't a university thing. That's probably the protesters that are out there.
Right. So are the protesters allowed to not allow a student who pays tuition access to their class in the library?
No, they're not allowed, but unfortunately they have kind of taken over that little area right there. But is there any other entrance that your son can enter through?
No, they are barricading every area for him to get into. And with all due respect, why is that even tolerated? Like, why should a Jewish kid have to go to another entrance?
It's not, I don't know if I'm going to say it's tolerated, but unfortunately the police are not intervening with that right now.
Now, some media personalities responded to the unrest gripping colleges. Megyn Kelly posted on X, quote, "Attractive, smart people don't join these protests. They have good lives and don't need fake activism to make themselves feel special." Journalist John Levine wrote a report on NYU professor Scott Galloway's remarks. He told Bill Maher that college students aren't having enough sex and they're turning to anti-Israel protests instead. CNN's Fareed Zakaria weighed in, posting, quote, "Why has the Gaza war spun colleges into chaos? Because campuses have weakened as actual communities where people mingle, interact, and get to know and trust each other." I don't know about any of those explanations necessarily, but I did see, and unfortunately we don't have the rights to it. We can't play the footage, but I've retweeted it on my timeline if you want to go follow me on Twitter. This Jewish student wearing a Jewish star being prohibited from entering UCLA's campus by protesters, and there's like other people behind him who have been allowed to be on campus, so I don't know what their criteria is for who they're stopping, but that cannot be allowed to go on.
It's interesting to see the escalation from these, basically what amounted to sort of a sit-in that was interfaith in nature, where last week during Passover, obviously the large number of Jewish students that are participating in the pro-Palestine protests ate, broke bread with, and celebrated with interdenominationally other kids in an environment that both professors and students have repeatedly attested to being safe and welcoming, in fact, for Jewish students. I do think the characterization of targeting Jewish students for whatever movement across the Quad, when it is clearly not about a Jewish and non-Jewish issue, as evidenced by who's participating in the actual protest, but a Zionist, anti-Zionist issue. And you can still object to that, right? You can still say that being a Zionist doesn't mean that you shouldn't be allowed to have access to a library. And I'm sure we'll continue to report on and unpack what's going on there exactly. But the, I think, deliberate framing of this as people antagonistic to people because of their religion, as opposed to their politics and their support for a state which is currently sieging occupied territory, and that has resulted in the death of upward of 35,000 people, 2/3 of whom are women and children, I think really is moving the goalposts in a way that I think is purposeful. Now, I think the students' actions in taking the Hamilton Hall is clearly an escalation, and that takes it from this realm of, are they allowed to do this because they have a First Amendment right to do this, to a realm of the students are accepting the burden of doing civil disobedience, knowing that they're breaking the law, saying, I'm willing to commit trespass,
right,
to violate what I think
breaking
is unjust.
not just a campus policy, but an actual law.
And that's the idea that this is the lesson of whatever, letter from Birmingham jail or whatever, 60s era civil rights protest, or apartheid movement era style protest, or any number of civil disobedience moments historically and around the world you want to point to, that there are times when the people make the assessment that this kind of escalation is necessary because negotiations, more modulated, minimally invasive techniques have gone ignored. And I think when the Columbia University ignores the overwhelming will of the student body to divest from Israel and ignores the overwhelming support of the student body and the professors and say, we should be allowed to stay on this campus and peacefully protest, and issues the order like they did yesterday by 2 p.m. to clear out, that's when there's a change of strategy and basically a sense that doing the completely legally permitted thing and the less escalatory thing isn't well calculated to actually achieve your goals.
I think Columbia's administration has probably done everything in the wrong order, right? They started with the police. They should have started with, okay, well, the encampments can be there for some set of time.
Yeah.
And then, okay, now this has gone on long enough, and you need to take down the encampments by some certain time and then if you don't, then you face academic issues, and then if it gets escalated beyond that, as it now has with them occupying a building, then you can face criminal issues. But they went police, amnesty, academic issues. It was totally in the wrong order. I think more broadly, we can disagree about this, that's fine. I think the protesters are at serious risk of looking unpopular and making their cause seem more unpopular when they storm and occupy buildings, and when there's videos of them preventing people, for whatever reason, from coming onto. Maybe they're preventing this individual in this video because he's a known supporter of Israel. It looks. Are they quizzing him? Are they quizzing people on their political views before they're allowed to set foot on campus? They're not allowed to do that either. They're doing it, but just ejecting a visibly Jewish student or preventing a visibly Jewish student from being on campus. I don't know if they want those optics, but that's what they're doing, and we'll see how it turns out, I guess.
People should really stick around and listen to today's programming in full. We did a really interesting episode with a Fordham University professor who himself was a participant in the 1968 protests at Columbia over the Vietnam War and a number of other issues. And the point that he made is that, yes,
he did not at all discount that possibility.
Yeah, he said student protesters are often unpopular. He said back in the 60s, their protest involved them basically taking a university administrator hostage in this very building. I think it was for about 24 hours or so, as part of their demands. And while we can sit here and debate whether or not that is kind of a morally legitimate technique, it's difficult not to look back at the protests that happened in 1968 at Columbia, the protests that happened in 1985 at Columbia over apartheid, and see that the consequences was successful, that the outcome was that students were able to leverage their power to actually get these political goals achieved, and that with the hindsight of history, the students are consistently right.
Yeah, I don't know about that they're consistently right. I mean,
When have they been wrong?
the question is, could they get?
Which of those issues or on another issue do you think the students have been wrong when they've engaged in this kind of protest?
No, I'm not saying they're wrong, but could their tactics have prevailed by not taking over a building, not taking somebody hostage, just having mass peaceful demonstrations? Could you have achieved the same thing without inspiring the immediate election of Richard Nixon on a pro-police social order platform?
Right, but the students' concern isn't Richard Nixon. The students' concern is a war, is whether or not they want to protest and bring an end to a war in Vietnam, whether they want to bring an end to South African apartheid, a racial segregated apartheid state. And in this case, whether or not they want to bring an end to apartheid in Israel, and at very least their own university's enormous multi-billion-dollar endowment being invested in that. And again, history suggests that this kind of technique works. And again, I can't say it as eloquently as our guest did, but he basically makes the point that when you are not adversarial, when your opponent is comfortable in their position, they are enabled, they are empowered, they are emboldened to ignore you. And I think that's what we've seen at Columbia, where despite, and in a lot of these universities, the students have voted overwhelmingly for divestment, and the university administrators have just said, no, we're not going to do it.
So the academic research on protests has generally, if I recall, is that nonviolent, explicitly nonviolent protests and campaigns are successful a majority of the time. Protests that involve violence are significantly less successful. So obviously it depends on how you're quantifying things and
what you're describing as violence. I think violence is a big word. I think that, for example, the 5-year-old who was murdered by the Israeli state, whose name now hangs on Hamilton Hall, that is a very clear indication of violence to me. The 3 Palestinian American students who were shot, one of whom is still paralyzed, that's a clear indication of violence to me. The 6-year-old Palestinian kid who was stabbed to death and his mother was grievously injured, that's an indication of violence to me. As much as I might disagree with, given if I knew more about the context, the choice to barricade any one student from an area on campus, or whether or not other kinds of techniques are what I would choose to do, is a very different thing from characterizing, say, entering a building and doing trespass as violence. Is property damage something that we're going to describe as violence? And regardless, you cannot ignore the fact that actions more violent than this one, kidnapping basically and holding hostage a university administrator back in the 1960s, resulted in the outcome that the students wanted. And occupying this exact same building,
that's a fallacy. You can always say, I took some action and then the inevitable result of history was this thing correcting, I'm responsible for it.
What other way is there to read it? There were a lot of things that we were responsible for. There were protests all over the country. There were the boycott, divestment, the South African apartheid divestment movement was huge. And Nelson Mandela himself said that he thought it was instrumental to South Africans being able to achieve equality in their own country. So I don't know how you can look at that legacy and look at the specific legacy of what's come out of Columbia University with this exact same building occupied twice in this exact same manner and see the arc of history validate the beliefs of those protesters on those occasions, and not think that history will likely demonstrate that these protesters, whatever you think of their technique, their beliefs are going to be validated in the not so distant future.
I suppose we'll see. More Rising right after this.